just press record. Good morning, everybody who's joining us. We're just letting the room fill up and then we'll get underway. Good morning, everybody just joining us. I see the room is filling up quite quickly. We'll just wait for about another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll kick off the event this morning. All right, let's get started, and I know others will join us as we continue. Good morning. My name is Chris Kilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria and on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to say, first of all, to everybody, Happy New Year. This is our first CIC Victoria event of 2021. So I'm glad that we've been joined by CIC Victoria members, and I know we have some new members, so welcome to you, and we have some guests. It's an early start for us, for Jonathan and myself here in Victoria, a little later in the day for Bill, who is in Colchester in the UK. So welcome again. And before we officially get started, I think, as always, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking First Peoples. That's the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and we gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish nations, whose traditional territories we are meeting on today. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with CIC, some of our new members and guests, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs issues and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's place in the world. And what makes us a little different, perhaps a lot different from many think tanks, is that we do have our national office in Toronto, but we also have 17 branches in cities across the country with some 1,400 members. And we're all very, very interested in politics, foreign affairs, and Canada's role in the world. You can find out more on us just by Googling the Canadian International Council. You'll find our webpage. And one thing that I would also say is that, besides having these great events with speakers like Bill, is that we do a lot of work with the students, especially here on Vancouver Island. And one thing I wanted to point out is that we're paying for the registration fees for 10 of our UVic students to head virtually to New York for a Model United Nations conference coming up in March. It's one of those things that we do that keeps us engaged and interested. And I could go on about our students, but I won't today. I'm also going to add my email into the chat box later on if you want to get a hold of me and hear more about CIC. Now, today's event has been structured as a conversation between our guest speaker, Bill, and Jonathan Manthorpe, and it'll be followed by a Q&A portion. And for this, you can just scroll down to the bottom. You'll see the Q&A box pop up, and you can ask your questions right there, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Now, as many of you know, Jonathan, who is going to be our moderator today, he's worked for some 40 years as a foreign correspondent and international affairs commentator for Canadian newspapers. He's been based in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and is the author of a number of books, Forbidden Nation, A History of Taiwan, that came out in 2008. His best-selling book, Claws of the Panda, in 2019, which focused on Beijing's campaign of influence and intimidation in Canada. And his latest book is Restoring Democracy, which was recently published, and I notice now strategically positioned just behind him on his bookshelf, which is very clever. Jonathan also has lots of experience working for governments and international organizations such as the UN and the World Bank. And he is one of our stalwarts out here in CIC Victoria. So thank you for being our moderator today. And I'll now hand over the floor to Jonathan, who will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Chris, who is my best PR agent, I have to say. Bill, welcome to Victoria. It would be nice to get you here in person, but there we are. We have to put up with the world as it is. Let me introduce Bill, with whom I'm going to discuss today his fascinating book, The Invention of China. Bill is an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House, and Chatham House, as many of you will know, is the sort of British sibling of the Canadian International Council. He is also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. I am very envious of that one. I would like to do that. And previously, he was a journalist working for the BBC in Vietnam and in Burma, both places which I know fairly well, and have had some of the more exciting times of my life. It was there that he reported extensively on the South China Sea disputes. This led to exhaustive research into the claims by Beijing to own the sea, the shoals and the islets, right down to the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia, which is about 1,200 kilometers from the nearest undisputed Chinese territory at Hainan Island. This led to his writing of a book in 2014, The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia. This sets out many of the mistakes, the misinterpretations, and the other nonsense which is behind the Beijing's claim to own the sea. So, Bill, let me start off by saying I believe it was that research and that book that led you to question the entire image proffered by the Chinese Communist Party of China as a nation with a 5,000-year history, which with firmly established borders, and a home to a homogeneous Chinese population with a common language and heritage. What set you off on that quest, and what did you find?
Well, it was exactly that. It was a voyage into the history of the South China Sea specifically. I mean, I wasn't a China expert before that, but the more I got into looking at the history of the South China Sea, the more I realized that the issues that I was looking at there also spilled over onto the land. And what I found was that so many things that people had assumed to be true, and I think people often assume that China is somehow more ancient than anybody else, and has been a sort of cohesive strand all the way through the last 5,000 years of history. And they forget about the various disjunctures and changes along the way. And also tend to sort of play down other experiences. So Southeast Asians have also got a very long history, yet they're always treated as a kind of adjunct to China, that China's the main event and everybody else kind of revolves around it. And what I was looking at in the 1920s, 30s, 40s was trying to understand, and actually when you, in the introduction, you mentioned it, this idea of China's claim going all, 1,000 miles south, almost as far as Indonesia. And why was it? In particular, why had China picked on a piece of seabed, a non-existent island, and called it its southernmost territory back in the 1940s? And the more I looked at this, the more I realized that actually it was a series of accidents and mistakes. And if I tell you that the name of this underwater feature is Zhengmu Ansha, and that the name is simply the Chinese rendition of the English name James, and that was taken from an English map which was translated into Chinese, then you start to see that the sort of idea of this ancient claim just starts to crumble as you look at it. And the more I looked at this, the more I realized that but frankly, there were officials and some scholars and intellectuals and journalists and enthusiastic people of many kinds who were just grabbing bits of information and sticking it together to form a case, and then claim islands in the South China Sea. And then when I started to look at, the history of what was happening on the land, arguments about where China's territory was on land, who the Chinese people are, what makes them different to the others, I began to realize that you had to kind of unpack a lot more issues which started in the late 19th century and went into the 20th century, and think about how a lot of modern ideas actually arrived in China and the process through which those ideas were literally, in some cases, translated into Chinese, and new words were adopted. And that's kind of where I came on the idea of the invention of China.
That fascinated me, that your portrayal of the situation at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, where the Chinese scholars, politicians, and so on forth of that period were not actually sort of rediscovering an ancient China, but trying to create a modern China crammed into Western definitions. And I found that notion absolutely fascinating. And I suppose, although I mean you mention it, although you don't go into it too far. I mean, it would be a rabbit hole in terms of your endeavors. They were, to an extent, I suppose, following the example of the Japanese and the Meiji Revolution and the industrialization and westernization of Japan. But why do you think that they followed that Western model in trying to create an ancient China?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's a sort of a caveat is to say that, of course, there was a civilization in this part of the world, and it does have a very long history, and there are many commonalities which exist throughout this long period of history. But at the same time, there was a reinvention at the end of the 19th century, which took some of these ideas and squished them into a modern form. And I think this reflected a crisis that was taking place in, we could say China, but more accurately, I guess we should say the Qing Empire, the Qing state, which was the last empire of China before the revolution of 1912. And which was in such a period of crisis that it had been attacked from the outside by European powers. It was crumbling from within. I mean, by far the bloodiest episode of the 19th century was the Taiping Rebellion. Something like 20 million people were killed during that uprising. And then towards the end, you had the war with Japan, which is critically important in 1894, 1895. And all of this sets Chinese intellectuals worrying about the future of them as a people, as a race. And they start to look at why European powers have become stronger. And they find the answers in many of the ideas that Europeans bring with them. So they talk about the nation and the white race and many of these other things, and start to think about whether the same things can apply in their own country, in China, in the Qing state. And as you mentioned, a lot of this is happening through Japan. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize in the book, is that many of the Chinese intellectuals who were grappling with these ideas weren't actually in China at the time. They were outside China, looking back at their country, often through the eyes, if you like, of a foreigner, that they were in exile, or they were refugees, or they were diplomats, or whatever. And actually, many of them were in Victoria, and Vancouver, looking back, because that was had a Chinatown and a very active exiled population. But Japan,
Sun Yat-sen came here several times.
Absolutely, and Liang Chao and Kang Youwei. In the book, I mentioned the importance of the Schwartz Bay ferry terminal to Chinese nationalism.
Or a little island off it.
A little island off it, yeah, not exactly the ferry terminal. But Japan is critically important because it modernizes just that little bit earlier, as you said, in the Meiji changes. And an awful lot of European literature is being translated into Japanese. And then in Japanese, it's much easier for Chinese exiles to read it, either in Japanese form, or it gets sort of translated a bit more into purely Chinese characters. It's accessible. And so you get ideas about, a word like nation comes into Japanese from German and then gets translated from German into Chinese and then adopted. Ideas about there should be a national language, that everybody should speak the same way, definitely comes from Germany into Japan and then from there into China. And all of these things. So what I looked at, each chapter really looks at a word and shows how this word was introduced into Chinese along with all the ideas that surround that word. So a word like nation is a commonplace, in English we use it all the time, but actually it has a whole series of meanings that were actually quite alien for the Chinese culture at the time and had to be brought into the language.
Perhaps for those in the audience who aren't familiar with China and Chinese history, Bill, could you just sort of describe what a disparate sort of place it was at, say, 1911, at the end of the Qing Empire, the numbers of languages that were spoken, and the various sort of peoples of different ethnic or regional heritages that made up what we think of as China these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably very hard to do it justice, frankly, just how diverse China was. I mean, the modern state of China, the People's Republic, officially recognizes 56 ethnic groups, of whom the Han, the majority, are one. But that was classic piece of sort of Russian Soviet-inspired anthropology, when people were classified into certain national minorities, and it loses a whole degree of sophistication. That many more groups, many more different ways of speaking, and I mean the classic study of Chinese languages, made the case that the difference between Cantonese and Shanghainese is the same as the difference between Spanish and Romanian. And we get into this argument about what's the difference between a dialect and a language, and that old great quote about a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And in some parts of the world, people say this is, I am different from you, therefore my dialect is a language and it's part of my national identity. Look at Spanish and Catalan, for example. And in other parts of the world, people say, no, we all speak the same language regardless of the differences. So look at the various different forms of Arabic, for example, and yet Arab nationalists say, yes, we all speak Arabic, it's the same language, despite many, many differences. And I guess you had something similar take place in China, that there was a desire to create a Chinese nation. So that led into a desire to create a Chinese national language. But the problem was that the various regional ways of speaking were so different from one another that actually it was the characters that had kept the country together, because you could look at the characters and you could pronounce them in different ways according to your local way of speaking. But once you tried to, and there were various attempts to try and use a Western style alphabet to actually represent the characters in a kind of Latin script. But as soon as you try to write down the pronunciation or standardize it, then the whole project just fell apart. And it took decades for Chinese language reformers to try and get a single language, Putonghua as it's now known, spoken by everybody. And of course, it's continues to create problems. I mean, it's at the root of the problems in Hong Kong. Frankly, it's the desire to impose Putonghua, common speech, on everybody, and that's really upset people in Hong Kong who quite enjoyed being different and feeling special.
Well, I lived in Hong Kong with my family from '93 to '98, and there was very little Mandarin spoken then. In fact, because I was spending a lot of time in China, I wanted to try and learn some Mandarin, but there was nowhere in Hong Kong that I could learn Mandarin. In fact, actually, it was rather amusing and very political, but I did discover one group that did teach Mandarin for journalists, and it was the sort of secret consulate of the Taiwanese. They were the only people but then when I went to Taiwan a great deal then, and have continued to do so. But of course, in Taiwan, only Chiang Kai-shek's exiles spoke Mandarin. Most of the people on Taiwan spoke Minnan, which is itself a dialect of Hoklo from Fujian province. So and unintelligible to people who only speak Mandarin. So these language differences and with them, I think probably cultural differences as well are very profound. I mean, from areas I've been in, I used to spend a lot of time in the countryside. And if you go to Yunnan province, which is basically an extension of Southeast Asia, there's very little cultural links with, say, central or western or northern China. And people there are still very intent on trying to maintain their languages and other cultural expressions. So even though the Communist Party has tried to unify everybody, it hasn't always worked very well. You point out that initially the Chinese Communist Party did not follow the picture of China that had been adopted by the former Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. And in fact, from early on, the Chinese Communist Party supported the right to self-determination for Tibet, Xinjiang in particular, both of which had been part of the Qing Empire, but not historically necessarily part of China. Well, then they also made no claim to own Taiwan at that point as well. What do you think changed the mind of Mao Zedong and his regime when they came to power in 1949, and why did they decide to set aside their notions of self-determination for those territories?
It's a really big subject. And can I begin maybe by taking it back? Because
sure.
one of the points I wanted, all of this begins in the past, but we have an idea of China which is of a homogenous Chinese state. We think we know what that looks like. But actually the Qing Empire was run by people whose origins were outside the Great Wall. They were Manchus. They were from what became known as Manchuria, up in the northeast near Korea. And they formed themselves into the Qing state and occupied Mongolia next door before they then invaded and occupied what we call China proper, the former Ming Empire. And from there, they then expanded into Tibet and to Xinjiang. And so for them, China was core China proper was one part of a multi-ethnic empire, which included Manchuria and Mongolia and Xinjiang and Tibet. And they all had different ways of relating to the center. The Manchus obviously had an organic connection to Manchuria, but they had different relations, for example, with the Islamic leadership in Xinjiang or with the Buddhist leadership in Tibet and with the Mongols. And the leader, the emperor, had to present himself in different ways. So when presenting himself to the Chinese population, he, was in the guise of a traditional Chinese emperor, but when approaching the Mongols, he would represent himself as a Mongol Khan and this sort of thing. So when the empire collapses in 1911 and the republic is born in 1912, they're having to argue about how they're going to keep this very disparate empire together. And the old way of doing it is basically say, let everybody kind of, keep their difference, and we will kind of just rub along as we used to somehow. And yet the nationalists are much more enthusiastic about creating a single Chinese nation. And basically they talk of the American example of smelting all these different sort of Europeans together to form a single American nation, and they wanted the same thing. But of course, in the 1920s, it's impossible because Tibet breaks away, becomes independent. So does Outer Mongolia. Xinjiang becomes autonomous, and even within China, it breaks into little fiefs. And so you're having all of these problems of the fact that there are people dreaming of a single nation, but the practicality just doesn't exist. and I think the nationalists, the Kuomintang that you mentioned in the question, they were smelters. They wanted to put everybody together in a great big pot and melt them into a single Chinese nation. But they were being advised and funded by the Soviet Union, which might be confusing to some people because they were nationalists and they end up being opposed to the communists in the end. But in the 1920s, they were working with the Soviet Union. And Stalin had an idea about national minorities, which is you give everybody their little autonomous territory, we respect them as national minorities, and you let them kind of run themselves to some extent. And then the Kuomintang were kind of obliged to follow that policy for a while. Although towards the end, as it gets nearer to the Second World War, they become much more back in the smelting variety. Meanwhile, the communists come along, and of course, they're much closer to Stalin and the Soviet Union. They start to adopt this national minority view with the proviso that, in theory, that everybody can exercise self-determination and become independent. So actually in the 1920s and 30s, well, so 1930s and 40s, you start to see, there are statements, from Chinese leaders about autonomy and the right to secede from China and all the rest of it. And they talk about the Taiwanese as a separate nation, for example, at one point. But then as soon as they get into power, then all of this stuff starts to become, well, in principle, you have the right to do that, but of course you never would. And then once you get into the realities of power politics and border disputes and things like that, then all the promises about autonomy and things slip away. But actually, the idea of the national minority and autonomy was still there, and immediately after, well, in the 1950s, after Tibet is invaded and incorporated, there's a lot of oppression and suffering in Tibet. And actually, Xi Jinping's father was one of the people who recognized this and sort of tried to revive the idea of autonomy and the Tibetans ruling themselves, and brought about an improvement in standards of living and respect for Tibetans within the framework. And it's interesting now that his son, Xi Jinping, the current leader, is basically overturning his father's work. He's gone back to this whole smelting way of running Chinese national policy, trying to make Tibetans, part of a single Chinese nation and erasing differences. So you can see quite clearly in the difference between Xi and his father how this policy has evolved.
And promoting settlers in Tibet with the aid of a Canadian railway.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, railways have been absolutely critical, to the integration of these far-flung parts and the settlement from outsiders.
Well, the same thing is happening in Xinjiang as well, I think, with the encouragement to settlers, hand settlers, so that to change the whole demographic of the place. Yeah. So the change in attitude was pretty swift, as you say. Once Mao came to power, the territorial claims and the passion for the territorial claims has really intensified in the last 70 years or so. Why do you think that has happened? It seems also, it seems sometimes as though it's almost become a main element in the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, that they pursue these territorial claims. And I sometimes find it hard to understand why that has happened. What's your feeling about that?
I think there has been a change since 1989, since the events of the Tiananmen Square protests and the aftermath. And the end of the Cold War, the sort of decline of communism as an ideological pillar for the regime, and a turn towards nationalism. I'm not the first person to talk about this, and there's a very good book called Never Forget National Humiliation, which talks about this, and the rise of the patriotic education campaign, which was instituted beginning in the 1990s to try to get Chinese citizens to be more proud of the country and to make that the sort of the anchor of their support for the regime. And you can see it in the way that the language has changed. I talk a little bit in the book about two words that are often translated to mean the Chinese people, but actually have very different meanings. So the communists used to talk about Zhongguo Renmin, the people of China. And that was a sort of communist formulation, you know, as in the sort of People's Liberation Army and all that sense of the word people. Whereas the nationalists used to talk about the Zhonghua Minzu, with Minzu meaning nation, can also mean ethnic group, but in this case, nation. And Zhonghua being a sort of more cultural definition of Chinese, as opposed to a sort of, you know, more socialist definition of, you know, or rather a statist definition of Zhongguo. And that these two phrases used to be the language of the two enemies, you know, the communists on one side and the nationalists on the other side. And it was only sort of, you know, from the 1990s onwards that you start to see the communists able to sort of experiment with using the nationalist formulation of the Chinese nation, and then using the two together, the people and the nation, to kind of bring them together, make them into the same sort of melting pot, as it were, as a way of, you know, bringing Taiwan into the story as part of a sort of, you know, attempt to sort of bring the island back to the motherland, as it were, and also to reach out to all Chinese around the world potentially, but certainly kind of within China, as part of a Chinese nation which is bigger than the people of the communist state. So I think we've kind of seen a change in the idea of the nation, and also I think we've seen a manufactured sensitivity about territory and the sort of the emotional consequences of, for example, Gap printing a T-shirt that doesn't print a map of Taiwan, you know, on a map of China, or you know, pop stars that fail to sort of, you know mention you know, aspects of history or whatever it might be. There's a deliberately, I would argue, manufactured outrage about such incidents, which doesn't necessarily have to come from the top all the time, but I think its existence has been cultivated, and now I think it pops up spontaneously whenever there is some slight perceived on the internet, for example.
We've seen a lot of this here in the last few years. You know, we have in Canada 1.5 million people of ethnic Chinese origin, most of them going back several generations. But since the efforts, really since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, the efforts to sort of marshal, if you like, the Chinese diaspora, which is about 50, 60 million people, as a sort of cohort of the People's Republic of China. The members, particularly of the United Front, who are attempting to recruit influencers here, have always put enormous emphasis on this notion that of the Chinese nation and of blood being thicker than water. And I think a lot of Canadians of Chinese heritage find this very, very troubling, because it has nothing to do with reality at all. But it is something that the Chinese Communist Party uses very much in its foreign adventures. Would you talk a bit, this is probably a good point, just to talk a bit about the claim to the South China Sea, which I found your story absolutely fascinating about the mistakes and misinterpretations. I mean, because it has been a hugely successful piece of imperial expansion. You know, I mean, I remember when I was living in Hong Kong, there was a declaration that the South China Sea was a township under the province of Hainan Island, and there was some lovely pictures of civil servants in white shirts and black worsted trousers sitting at typewriters on, I think it was Woody Island, and we all laughed. But of course, you know, 20 years later, we have 7 militarized island outposts, and essentially the South China Sea is now a Chinese lake. But tell us a bit about the background and how the claim came to be made, and how they've managed to actually make it reality.
Well, I'm going to cut a long story short here, of course. I could go on at some length, but it emerges in rather a neat 40-year period between 1907 and 1947. And what happened, it's always in response to a crisis. So 1907, a Japanese merchant is discovered mining guano on a remote island called Pratas, which is about halfway between Taiwan and Hong Kong. And in the context of 1907, which is a lot of revolutionary activity, anger about foreign powers attacking China and all the rest of it, this becomes an emotional cause. And it results in a sort of a boycott, and the Japanese government wants to end the boycott. So it says to the Qing government, if you can find a way to prove that this island belongs to you, then we'll recognize it. As long as you pay the merchants compensation. And so it takes them a very long time, but eventually they find a document which mentions this island. Japan agrees to recognize it, and the Japanese merchant is paid 130,000 silver dollars to pack up and leave. And in the course of this, the Qing authorities also learn, I think pretty much for the first time, about the existence of another set of islands called the Paracel Islands, which are closer to Vietnam. And these have been long known to foreigners because they had long been a danger to shipping. And so anybody sailing from, say, Singapore to Hong Kong knew about the risks of these islands. But the Vietnamese would say that they had claimed them back in the 19th century, but certainly no Europeans had bothered to claim them up until that point. And the Chinese hadn't until 1909. And so they organized a big expedition. It's a big propaganda thing with reports in the newspapers and photographs, and they, go and stick flags in the islands like sort of good empire builders do and say these are ours. But they're completely underwhelmed by the Paracels. There's no economic value to them. They only, think about maybe using them as some kind of sort of prison colony. And so within a few days, they just literally, they forget about the Paracels. They only come back into thought sort of in the 1930s when France, which is the colonial power in Vietnam, makes a claim and China makes a counterclaim. And while that's going on in the 1931, 1932, France then claims separately the Spratly Islands, which are much further south, closer to Borneo. And this causes complete confusion in China because they don't realize the difference, and there are various documents, from the government saying, can the Navy go and find out, where these islands are, and the Navy, write back and say that these islands don't exist. We're talking about the other ones, but in the confusion, some Chinese activists start to assume that the two islands were both claimed at the same time back in 1909, and although the government doesn't formally claim the Spratlys, some people start to think that they should rightfully belong to China. That then causes the government to have an investigation where they take British maps in the main and try and translate the names, which is why there are quite a few oddities around the South China Sea now. So, for example, there's a Chinese island in the Paracels called Jinyin Dao, which means Money Island. It's named after an Englishman called William Taylor Money, who was a manager of the East India Company. And other names were given, for example, North Danger becomes Bei Xian, simply the English name translated. But then they would make mistakes. So there's this place we talked about at the beginning, James Shoal. Shoal is an old English word meaning shallow. And this was translated with the Chinese word tan, which means sandbank, which could be above water potentially or below water. And then the committee produces this list with all these names. A geography professor comes along, looks at the list of names, looks at a British map that he has with these sort of features marked on them, and he colours some of them in, these underwater features, and makes them look like islands. And then he draws a line around them and says, right, all of these islands, which don't actually exist because they're underwater, these are the shoals that I was referring to. And he says, this is China's ancient territory, which is why now the Chinese 9-dash line goes all the way down as far as Borneo and to the Philippines and to Vietnam, because it has to include these underwater features, which are non-existent islands. And to this day, China claims a non-existent island as its southernmost territory. So that's a little flavor of the kind of the accidents and mistakes that led to this potentially catastrophic confrontation in the South China Sea.
We've touched on it a bit, but we've all heard, I think, about Xi Jinping's China dream, which he sort of first voiced fairly soon after coming to power. It's very, I think, still indistinct what this means. But I wonder if what your sense is of the relationship that Xi Jinping's China dream has with, if you like, this mythological creation of a Chinese state, and where he goes from here with it. What is the China dream from your perspective?
I think, there's quite a good book recently published about these sort of bits of official rhetoric, these China's slogan politics and Chinese dream and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people and the community of shared future and all these, and the Belt and Road Initiative, all these slogans that get put out. And the argument is that the slogan is sort of deliberately there as a sort of throwing the frisbee out in front of you, and you have to sort of run along and catch up. And in that, attempt to catch up with the frisbee, some meaning will kind of somehow, be filtered into this concept. And so I think the Chinese dream is deliberately a vague concept, and can be filled with all kinds of meanings depending on which part of the government you work for, whether you're a company, whether you're a sports team looking to fulfill the Chinese dream by winning some medals or something, or whether you're building an island in the South China Sea, and that's also part of the Chinese dream. But it clearly, I think, has some kind of territorial elements to it. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese people won't be complete until all of the motherland is returned, which would include Taiwan, South China Sea, the bits of the Himalayas, and the East China Sea. And it sort of has a sort of the idea of a historical destination. And I guess the sort of the big date that we're looking towards is 2049, which would be the centenary of the People's Republic of China. And I guess an idea that that's some kind of deadline where at which China would like to have solidified its territory, reincorporated Taiwan and the other islands and the Himalayan borders, which obviously, the closer we get there, starts to make people nervous about what China is prepared to do to bring that about.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my next question. I mean, as you say, there's a fair amount of anxiety around in international circles at the moment, I suppose particularly concerning Taiwan at the moment, but the other two, the Himalayan territories, there's been quite a bit of pushing and shoving with Indian forces in recent months, and the Chinese incursions into the air and sea around the Senkaku Islands continues unabated. Every now and again, the Japanese put out figures on these things and about the number of overflights by Chinese warplanes and so on and so forth, and the pressure seems to be the same as ever. How would you judge? What's your sort of risk assessment of whether Xi would take the China to war over particularly Taiwan, I guess, but also the others?
I think the Chinese leadership is well aware that the most important thing is to please the people and keep them on side, and that anything which would interrupt the economy and growth in living standards and all that kind of thing would be very dangerous to Communist Party rule. So I don't think it's something that they would do lightly, as it were. So I think that the strategy will be just a constant pressure, just sort of like a ratchet, really, kind of it gets pulled forward, but never goes backwards. It might stay still for a while, but kind of to ramp up the pressure. I guess this sense that, China feels it has time, it has the mass of, huge economy, huge population, and then it can just continue to sort of chip away at a level which is just below that of conflict. I mean, we could see this in the South China Sea, for example, that China clearly has the capacity, if it wanted to occupy every single feature in the South China Sea, particularly against a country like the Philippines. But yet there's a sort of sense of restraint, a recognition, I think, that if it goes too far, then it damages its reputation. Therefore, I guess that acts as some kind of constraint. But I guess, the overall thing is, I think that China collectively loses from this focus on territory because it makes all the neighbors anxious about China. And so, my argument would be, if I was sitting with Xi Jinping, I would say, look, you're getting worried about, an island which is the size of this room, or a few meters on a dry riverbed in India or whatever. Look at the damage that you cause to your relations with your neighbors just by getting focused on these rather pathetic, amounts of territory. Wouldn't it be just better to kind of compromise, let the issue go away, and get on with becoming the prosperous center of Asia? I don't know how much you listen to me though.
Well, I agree with you on that. Just one quick question before I can see that Chris is lining up to bring some questions from the audience. But just one final question: what should our response be as other countries outside the sphere of influence, or the immediate sphere of influence of the People's Republic of China? I mean, should we call Beijing's bluff on some of these issues, or what do you think our attitude should be from a greater distance than their neighbors?
Yeah, it's easy for us to say when we're a long way away, but all our countries have come under pressure, and I think that is the classic tactic is to train all the pressure on one country at a time. And at the moment, for example, Australia is getting a lot of heat. So everybody go and buy Australian wine and lobsters as a means of saving democracy. It'll be our turn next. The UK and Canada, I think today, have just announced something on Xinjiang forced labor. Are we going to come under pressure next? And are we going to get support from other countries? That would be nice. So therefore, we'll have to support other countries when they come under pressure too. So yeah, I think some clear statement of principles and some working together is going to be necessary.
Thank you, Bill, and let me hand it over to Chris now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Bill. We do have quite a few questions. I mean, some of them we won't be able to address in this forum. Someone's asked about China's role in Africa, which is a great question, and I think it's something we'll have to address in another event. But more to
read Howard French's book.
More to what we're talking about today. Fanny here in Victoria is sort of saying, when we talk about language in China and wanting to have a single language, a single culture, it's not a lot different from what we see in other countries wanting to have the same thing. So are the Chinese an exception here? I suppose we've been touching on the issue of the Uyghurs and how China goes about creating homogeneity, which is probably the issue. But do you feel that, is China any different from what we see elsewhere in the world? I suppose so, but what are the key factors there? Right.
Good questions. And yes, I mean, to some extent, China is following a model which was developed by European countries about nations and homogeneity and all the rest of it. But other places have gone in different directions. I mean, for example, India, has no national language. Each state can decide its language, and English has just sort of been left over as a temporary arrangement, since independence and never been got rid of. But I guess I imagine some, Chinese leaders looking at India would say, well, there you go. We don't want to be like that. We want to be, centrally directed and homogenous. The idea, I mean, it's clear that China for a long time was willing to tolerate diversity in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, and now has decided against that. and my understanding is that it's really been the influence of a few academics who looked at the experience of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia during the 1990s and said, we don't want that to happen here. So therefore, we have to sort of double down on creating, a homogenous nation. Up until recently, my views on this were always that the more you try to suppress a nationalist movement, the more it would grow, and you'd end up with a worse problem. But the amount of resources that China has been able to throw at Xinjiang, with these, 1 million people in labor camps and re-education practices, it's intimidating. And I guess, it may well be that this follows in the line of other states' practices in the past, but they weren't that great either, frankly. And we have we are at a moment where we maybe should be saying, this is wrong. It's hard to know what we can actually do about it. I mean, I don't think we would be able to successfully bring economic sanctions on China to sort of make it change its policy, but we can do things to keep Xinjiang products out of our supply chains and all the rest of it. Hopefully we could persuade China that this way of behaving is not acceptable. I mean, our chances, I admit, our chances of change of direction are rather small, but I don't think that means we have to turn a blind eye and just say, well, we were beastly to various minorities in the past, so therefore we give China a pass.
I have a question from Phil Calvert here in Victoria, and Phil is one of our noted experts when it comes to China and the Asia Pacific. And I'm just going to read his question so I don't miss anything. So Phil asks, do you see a link between the late Qing Ti Yong approach to the challenge of the West, that is keeping the fundamental Chinese nature of the society, but then using Western technology, and what you describe as their adaptation of the concept of the nation? Are they responses that are part of the same thinking?
I think they were generational differences. So I think there was an earlier generation, the sort of 1860s, 70s, 80s, that had this idea of Chinese essence, Western learning, that China would somehow could remain pure, that its civilization was superior to the foreigners' civilization, but that the foreigners just had some nice tricks with manufacturing, and if you could just get the sort of manufacturing and retain the Chinese essence, then that was all that you required. And that led into what was called the self-strengthening movement. The opening of shipyards, where Western engineers came and taught people how to build warships and cannons and all the rest of it. But I think that approach was almost literally sunk by the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, when those ships that had been built, were literally sunk by the Japanese, and it was a humiliating defeat. And I think it was then that a lot of these ideas of gradual change, lost power and created a space for a kind of new set of ideas that were much more, about changing society as a whole, bringing in ideas of race and nation and territory and all the rest of it. That was the opening. And so you get 1895 to 1898, a lot of activity in Beijing, a lot of contact between missionaries and reformers, and sort of debate and dialogue between Easterners and Westerners. And then there's a sort of counter coup in 1898, and a lot of these reformers run into exile into Japan. And that's really the decade, 1898 up until sort of 1910, 1911. That's when a lot of this intellectual heavy lifting, takes place, and most of it's in Japan.
Coming back then to languages, Ron in Toronto has asked, have you found any official effort by the Chinese government to actually eliminate a language or dialect in perhaps, post 1949 or even more recently?
Well, yes. I mean, I mentioned some in the book. I mean, the book doesn't really look in great detail at present day language policy, but I tried to take a couple of modern examples to kind of show how the connection between the debates back then and the situation now. And there was, hang on, I've got to get my example right. I think it was a guy in Guangdong, in Guangzhou City, I think. And he had been trying to sort of keep Cantonese going. And I think the authorities were prepared to, tolerate that so long as it was spoken. But what he tried to do was actually write a textbook that was in Cantonese with certain phrases that were only used in Cantonese and kind of ways of speaking and actually guides to pronunciation, I think. And that was suppressed. So it's kind of, I think it was okay for Cantonese to be a spoken language or dialect way of speaking, but to actually write it down and demonstrate its separateness in print was too far, I think. Otherwise, I think the example in Hong Kong has not been to suppress Cantonese so far, but to give incentives for people, to give extra money to schools that teach in Mandarin, to kind of relegate Cantonese to the status of a foreign language, which maybe Mandarin had been a few years ago, and then to try and gradually, parents are incentivized because the schools that get the extra funding will be better schools, and so the more ambitious parents will send their kids to the Mandarin language schools rather than the Cantonese schools. More subtle techniques than that.
Can I just backing up that? A few years ago, I was up in the Naxi country and in northern Yunnan on the borders with Tibet in Lijiang, and the Naxi language there was no longer taught in schools. Some of the people were trying to maintain it, but they had to do it secretly. The authorities were doing everything they could to suppress the language, and I suspect that that's probably happening with a number of, particularly the small minority languages around China.
Yeah. And Phil has just popped up on the chat to remind us about the protests in Mongolia, which similar things there about the transition and the status of Mongolian. Obviously a separate language group to the Chinese language families, and again the same things about making it more of a foreign language than a language of instruction.
So I have 3 questions here, which I'm going to try to morph into one. So Bill, I don't know if you have a pen handy there to try to follow along here. Don here in Victoria says, look, I'm not excusing China's expansionist policies like in the South China Sea, but are they not like any other empire or large country seeking to spread its wings in their immediate area? So that's one part. The second part, though, is moves beyond the South China Sea, because we see China looking towards the Arctic and claiming to be a near Arctic nation and building an icebreaker fleet and so forth. So we do see more expansion, just not in the South China Sea. And then another question which ties into this is that as China seeks to expand its footprint in Asia, is the Chinese diaspora, which has been in many of the countries in that region for generations, are they actually a constraint on Chinese ambitions? We often think of them as potentially an enabler, but are they actually a constraint, and that they don't really want to see this taking place?
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Okay, yeah, 3 good questions. Well, I think the sort of the good news about China's territorial ambitions is that there is a line around them. It's not sort of like 1930s Germany, where as soon as got one bit of territory, the question changed. Let's go and grab another bit, China's dreams of territorial expansion are the Himalayas, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, and we don't sort of see any sign really that China wants to go beyond that and sort of reclaim bits of what's now Russia, for example, although I imagine you'll find people talk about such things on the internet. So in that sense, the good news is that its ambitions are circumscribed, but the problem, of course, is that even those ambitions are contested by other people. So it's going to be a rough ride, nonetheless.
It's 18 hours.
So I think yes, in many ways, China is behaving like many other states have done. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book was actually to show that China is like many other states. I think there's been a way of thinking about China that it was somehow more ancient, more special, more authentic than other countries in the region. And I wanted to show that China too went through this process of reinvention to create a new set of identities, just as pretty much every modern country has done. As Italy had to reform itself out of lots of little sort of states, and Germany the same. The Ottoman Empire broke up into different bits, and China went through similar but different debates, trying to reconcile its past with a difficult present. So yes, so China is like other countries, but that doesn't necessarily make it an easy ride in the future. China is an Arctic power. I think China technically calls itself something like a near Arctic country or something like that, which is quite amusing. Occasionally I've done sort of shared roundtables, and I did one at the Munich Security Conference a couple of years ago, which had participants from Southeast Asia and Europe and China, and it was about the South China Sea. And China's arguments were all about sort of restricting freedom of navigation, why the American Navy and other navies shouldn't go sailing around the South China Sea because it upsets the Chinese. And pointed out that this organization that I was working with for this roundtable, the following day was hosting a roundtable on the Arctic. And I said, and at the end of my thing, I quipped. I said, I'm sure we would welcome the Chinese participants to this discussion, where they will make exactly the opposite arguments to the ones that they've just been making in this room today. Because for the Chinese, they want to encourage freedom of navigation, and no state should have the right to block anybody else from sailing through. So China is developing this attitude towards international law, which is, we'll do whatever the rules allow us to do everywhere else, but when it comes to our backyard, we're going to have a different set of rules that will limit people's freedoms of navigation and whatever. And this, I think, is what worries Western powers, is that the idea of international law is it's supposed to be the same everywhere. You can't just sort of give yourself an opt-out and then seek to take advantage of it when it suits you. So yeah, I think that's and there's been an optimistic line of thinking that as China comes to realize this, it will kind of relax on things in the South China Sea, but I don't really see that happening. That said, everybody knows how difficult it is to actually operate in the Arctic. So how likely it is to see Chinese ships sailing through the Northwest Passage, I guess, is still a work in progress. As for the Chinese diaspora, very good question. I don't feel qualified to answer it. We're seeing quite an active debate and discussion about the role of Chinese diaspora communities around the world. And obviously Australia is right at the forefront of this. Some of that debate is quite unpleasant. Some of it is very positive. And yeah, when you do see people lining up to attend United Front style events, but when you see what proportion they are of the overall ethnic Chinese population in the country, they are still relatively small, I guess. The problem, I suppose, is that China has been very successful in linking economic success, access to trading opportunities in China with support for political things and United Front operations and things. I guess that's a worrying element of it.
Well, thank you for that. And I see we're at 10:04, and we've managed to get through all of the questions for the most part. And I think it's been a great discussion in terms of providing some of those meaty details behind what is happening in China. So I really do appreciate that. Jonathan, Bill, do you have any final points you'd like to make before we close for today?
Read Bill's book, it's good.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing.
Thank
if you want to learn more, It's called The Invention of China. And I think it would be a good read. And I'm fascinated now to hear that Victoria and Vancouver might be in the book or are in the book. And there might be something to be read about there that would be of great interest to us locally. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody that's joined us here today. We have a couple of other events coming up very soon. One focusing on money laundering on the 18th of January here in British Columbia and the international implications of that. And coming full circle to our talk today, we'll also have Dr. John Price speaking to us. And his subject is going to be Orienting Canada, Race, Empire, and the Trans-Pacific, where he's going to look at some of the historical issues that Canada has had in the Pacific, dealing with issues around Chinese immigration and the Japanese Canadian population and so forth. And I think it will tie in very nicely to what we've heard today. So on behalf of all of us at CIC, Bill and Jonathan as well, thank you for your time today and for this great conversation. And with that, I'll close us and say goodbye and all the best for 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Bill. Keep in touch.
Okay, we'll do. All the best.
Bye.